Welcome to Short Course, episode 107 for August 11th, 2023. I'm your host, Ben Barry. Quick administrative note at the beginning of this one, and then we'll get to the actual shooting-related topical content shortly. It appears that the minutes sometime between yesterday and today were posted from the meeting last Wednesday that I talked about on the last episode, the one where they voted to roll back the effective date of the dues changes. The minutes are pretty straightforward. They do show that the meeting was called as a special meeting, which is something that the bylaws provide for. Basically, the president or any three members of the board can call for a special meeting that is limited to a single topic. Bylaws changes can't be voted on in a special meeting, and there's no requirement to notify the members that a special meeting is happening before it's happened, which is kind of weird because in the minutes for this special meeting, they vote to waive the notification requirement, which by my reading of the bylaws, they don't have, but whatever. Everything looks on the level. It was the meeting. They basically discussed the issues, voted on delaying the start, voted on refunding people the difference between the higher rate and what they would get if they had renewed at the current rates, and then voted to waive confidentiality, voted to adopt the statement that was published, and then voted to adjourn. So pretty straightforward, nothing big there, but I just thought it was interesting to close the loop from last week and just say, the minutes have been posted and the meeting shows basically what we expected. So if that is of interest to you, those minutes are up now as of 8 days after the meeting happening. So typically, like I said, the meetings happen on Tuesday and they have the minutes posted by the Friday of that week. For whatever reason, this one obviously was on a Wednesday and it took until the following Thursday, but whatever. So the topic that I was originally planning to address last week, and that we'll get to presently, is the idea that I think it is useful in structuring your training to conceptualize your training into cycles and to explicitly look at your training as building up to something. And I think the main reason that this is helpful is without this, training can just become a sort of endless grind. And so by giving yourself a sense of a destination that you're working towards, that you reach, and then you set the next destination, I think is actually really productive. And it helps you stay motivated. It helps you kind of feel like you're not just throwing your time away at some endless pursuit, but that you're actually working towards some definite goal. And when I say goal, there are really two main types that you can have. One is an actual, some kind of measurable goal, like making a certain classification or being able to shoot a certain time on a certain standards, or even a set of standards. Maybe you want to be able to shoot a certain time on 2 at 25, and then another time on a build drill, and then another time on accelerator, something like that. You come up with those sets of goals, or maybe you just want to make A class or M class or GM or whatever it is, and you set that as the goal, and then you work towards each one in a cycle. The second type of goal is something deadline based. Typically, you've signed up for a major match and the match is happening on a certain date, whether you're ready or not. And so the goal is to be as prepared as you can be when that comes. And obviously that has pros and cons. One is it sort of forces you to operate on a schedule that's not necessarily in your control. And so you can't just kind of put things off forever. But the downside is it makes it so that you have to learn to perform when you're ready or not. Whereas if every month you're trying to make M class, then every month is a new month and you can keep trying for as long as you want. But most of what I'll talk about today is about more of this deadline-based, match-based training cycle type of mentality. And I can't really say, if I were in B class right now and my goal was to make GM, would I break it down into a series of milestones? Would I say, okay, I want to sort of go through this process of having a training cycle to make A, and then another training cycle to make M, and then another to make GM? I can say in my experience, the way it went for me is I basically classed up one class a year. So it basically took me a year to make A year to make M, and then a year to make GM after that. And at that point, I wasn't really structuring my training this way. I was basically just dry firing as much as I could, as hard as I could. And that didn't really work. Originally, my goal was to actually make GM in 2016, and after making M in February, I basically just petered out. Now, I had a bunch of other stuff going on in 2016, including getting married, so that put other demands on my time, but I definitely felt kind of burned out. And when I made it into GM in early 2017, it was just barely, and it was not from an abundance of training. I had not really been grinding dry fire at all. It was just kind of trying to keep up and, do regular kind of maintenance dry fire. And it happened to be enough that I hit that goal when I kind of stopped trying, which is a whole other different discussion. But you can adapt this discussion into that idea of a classification or a sort of standards-based goal however you like. I don't have a strong opinion on that because I don't really have much experience with it. But what I can talk about is how I look at structuring my season each year, which is that I basically identify each major match that I'm going to shoot, and they're usually spaced out far enough that each one sort of forms its own natural training cycle. And this is one thing that I do recommend everybody involved with the sport do, whether you shoot IDPA, USPSA, whatever your sport is. At least once a year, I do think it is a good thing to sign up and shoot some kind of major match, something bigger than just a local club match. Even if you don't see yourself as a serious competitor or anything like that, just to give yourself something to work towards, something to focus your season around and give it that structure. How do you find good, bigger matches to shoot? Well, obviously you can talk to folks at matches, ask them what matches they are shooting this year or what matches they've shot in the past, what matches they would say are good. You can, in the case of USPSA, they have actually done a pretty decent job with the major match calendar. So if you are logged in as a member to the USPSA website, you can see a list of all the major matches happening in the whole country and skim through it and look for anything near you. Or arguably more useful, you can go to Practice Score and in the filter search settings, just filter for IDPA, USPSA, whatever type of match, and then level 1, 2, or 3. So filter out the level 1 club matches, and then it should rank them by proximity to you. So that should give you a good idea of what's going on close to you. But I definitely think it's worth signing up and shooting at least one level 2 match a year, just to have, like I said, something to structure your season, some kind of check-in, something bigger than your month in, month out kind of match. And if you're really feel like you're not ready for that, or you're intimidated by it, sign up to work it. Almost every match can use another person doing something or other, and it'll be a great experience. Honestly, getting to shoot with the staff on staff day at a match, especially if it's your state match or something, will be a good opportunity. You'll get to meet a lot of folks that are dedicated on the volunteer side. So even if you feel like you're not quote unquote ready for a level 2 match, just see if the match director is interested. Email them and see, hey, do you need another person to work staff? I'm happy to help show up. Or just sign up. If you've shot 4 or 5 club matches, a well-run level 2 won't be any more difficult, and in a lot of cases it'll be less so. It's worth it. I would definitely encourage anybody listening to this to, if this is your first year in the sport, maybe wait a year, but maybe don't. In the same way that the only way to get the hang of your first club match was to go out and shoot the first one, the only way to get the hang of your first bigger match is the same way. So especially if you've got a really good one that people speak of highly around you, definitely sign up and shoot it if you can. But whether you are signed up to shoot one major match a year or 2 or 3, the approach that I take is to look at the time between whenever I start training in the spring, which, typically everybody will take some kind of off season, whether it's just through Christmas or all the way up until it starts to warm up and you can actually go live fire outside. Everybody's different. I like to start getting back into dry fire if I can in January and February. Doesn't always happen, obviously, with life and everything else going on. It definitely doesn't always happen. But what I will do is I will actually take a physical paper calendar, because that's how I prefer to do it, and I will write out how many days I have until my first major match, which most years ends up being either the South Carolina section match or Area 6, which are both local to me and both tend to be spring matches, which is not my favorite thing for Area 6, but it is what it is for the past few years. And so that sort of guides my training. And so if Area 6 is in the middle of April one year and I start training in the middle of February, then I basically have a 60-day training cycle. And that's pretty typical, I would say, given the way my year tends to space out. So for example, right now I am 36 days away from the North Carolina section, and that'll be in the middle of September, and then it'll be roughly 60 days from then until the middle of November, which is when the IPSC Nationals will happen. So I'll have that second 60-day training cycle, and I'm treating that as sort of a separate training cycle for reasons that we'll get to. So the first thing you do when you are conceptualizing your training in a cycle is figure out when it ends, figure out what your goal is, or either what the deadline of the major match that you're working up towards is, or what the goal is, whether it's a set of standards or whatever. And then from there, what I find is helpful, what has really worked in the past, is to figure out a training schedule that I want to work on in that time frame. And typically what I've found works the best for me, which again, I'm no national contender, but it's what I have found in my experience works, is to set a goal of a certain number of days a week that I want to dry fire. And typically that number is either 3 or 4. And the nice thing about that is it gives you a little bit of flexibility where if you know that you have some event, some party, or something, you're meeting up with friends on Thursday and Friday, well, then you need to get your 3 dry fire sessions knocked out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then maybe do one on Saturday or something like that. Now, the really hardcore guys, yeah, they're going to be dry firing every day of the week or, what have you. But for me, that's what works, is defining a certain number of days out of the 7 days in a week that I'm going to dry fire, and then hitting that goal number however I can. So if I, again, if I have something on Monday, well, then I have to pick it up later in the week. That's just how it goes. But what I find is having that sort of, instead of trying to say, okay, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which maybe that works for you. Maybe you have a very predictable schedule and all your recurring events are on Tuesdays and Thursdays and you can plan around that. Or, maybe you look at your calendar at the beginning of the week and say, I've got something Tuesday and Friday, and I'm going to train every other day that I don't have a commitment. Everybody has a different formula that works for them. This is just kind of what I have found works for me. For example, I'm not someone who can get up and dry fire first thing in the morning. I've tried it a few times. I just do not find it very productive. And so, especially with kids around, dry fire for me means pretty much after the kids go to bed. So sometime between 8 p.m. and midnight. So figure out your timeline, the number of days you have until the match, just to give you some kind of sense of exactly how far away it is. And then figure out your ideal training schedule. And then when it actually comes time to actually put on the gear and dry fire, when you look at your training in this cyclical nature, you want to start in the early cycle. You want to start with very fundamental drills. So these are going to be relatively simple: draw to a sight picture, reload to a sight picture, turn and draw, maybe draw, shoot a couple, reload, shoot a couple. At most, you're going to do like a 6 reload 6 or an El Presidente type of a drill. Nothing super complex, nothing where you're really trying to string too many skills together, because in the early cycle, the goal is to really narrow down and find all the improvements that can be made in the individual techniques. So maybe you've been wanting to change some nuance of how you draw, how you grip the gun, how you reload, something like that. And this is the time to do it, this early cycle. And the reason thinking about it in cycles like this is helpful is if you're doing it right, towards the end of your last training cycle, you may have noted something in your dry fire where you thought, oh, when I grip the gun like this, maybe something different happens. And so if you're doing it right, you actually don't want to be messing with that the week before a major match. What you want to do is make a note of that. And then when you go into the next early cycle part of your next training cycle, you have a list of things that you've stumbled upon over the past few weeks or months of interesting things to try. So you're doing some sort of exploratory testing. You are trying new things. You're taking tweaks, and then you're also just trying to really refine the details. Maybe you really wish that when you go to grab the magazine out of your pouch, you were grabbing it more precisely instead of just kind of swiping it up in your hand and having a sort of inconsistent grip on the magazine rep to rep. Now is the time to really focus on those narrow things and really work on small technique changes. And if you think about it like a pyramid, you're laying the foundation. You're putting down the building blocks here. And so this is the time where you consciously focus on really micro technique things. You really, like I said, try out new things that you may have noticed from previous training cycles that were kind of interesting, but you're working on your sort of fundamentals. So one drill that I think of as being a good example of this is I actually find not starting every drill with a draw during this part of training, and I mean generally throughout training is a good thing to start some drills without a draw, because what it lets you do is establish an ideal grip off the clock or between when you hit the button on your timer and the buzzer goes off. So for example, a common early cycle drill that I'll work on is just something as simple as hit the timer, establish a what I think is a high quality grip, and then as soon as the buzzer goes off, reload the gun and then reacquire a sight picture and break the shot. And so one thing that's nice about this with shooting a double single gun, but I guess the same would apply to a striker gun where you only get one live trigger pull, is you actually do get that practice of reloading to an actual live trigger pull, but you're doing it in a way that you have that reload in there to kind of confuse you. So you build that good grip before the reload, and then you have to rebuild it on the clock after the reload. But the idea is by having it sort of fresh in your mind, fresh in your muscles, so to speak, I find it's nice as a way to sort of practice building it twice, once, where you have a little more time, and then once at speed. So doing that kind of thing where it might be a 1 or 2 or 4 or 6 shot, so to speak, dry fire drill, but you're really focusing in on the details. The middle of the cycle, again, if you want to divide your training into thirds, right? So, I've got 36 days between now and the North Carolina section. So in theory, I could say, well, I'm going to do 12 days early cycle, 12 days mid cycle, and 12 days late cycle. You can, the boundaries are kind of fuzzy, but roughly you want to divide your training into thirds, more or less. Mid cycle is where you might actually start going for par times and really chasing goals on individual drills. So based on what you want to work on, based on the skills that you've decided in your previous training cycle and in your early cycle, what you want to make progress on, things that you feel like, okay, this is working, I just need to really hammer it in. You might decide that you want to work on a particular drill, whether it's 4 aces or 6 reload 6 or anything else, right? Any standard drill. And that's where you're in this middle cycle is really, to me, the time where you're really chasing par times. You say, I really want to work down to, this goal time on this drill. For me, in the early cycle, having drills as a structure, as things to do is good, but I'm not necessarily trying to chase the par time because it's more, to me, it's more exploratory. I'm more trying things out. I'm trying to see, okay, what happens if I do this? And sometimes it takes a few sessions of trying a different technique, or you have to dry fire it one day and it's just not working. And then you go to sleep, you wake up the next day and you go to dry fire it and everything's just clicking. And so it's really tough in that early cycle to make big gains. In my experience, it's more about finding the nuances that you want to focus on and really refining those details. And then in this middle cycle, that's where you're really working on chasing par times and that kind of thing. And then the late cycle is where you start to go away from chasing par times and you're really chasing correctness. You really want to deliver the right techniques on demand in varying situations. And so to me, this is where things like setting up 5 or 8 different dry fire targets and picking 3 or 4 of them that you're going to use in a particular drill, visualizing in that order, and then executing that order, and then the next rep picking a different 3 or 4. So you're exercising the same skills, but on different targets in every single order. So every single run is a sort of cold run. That to me is a sort of late cycle kind of thing. It's hard to really chase a par time when you're changing the target order every time, just because naturally, shooting an El Pres array, 3 targets, shoulder to shoulder, it's always going to be easier left to right, right to left. But there is training value in going middle, left, right, and then, reload right, left, middle. There's training value in varying that, but if all you're doing is trying to chase a particular par time in dry fire, which is valuable, but it's hard to do that at the same time that you're also changing up the target order every time and that kind of thing. So to me, the late cycle is really where it becomes less about hitting objective standards and more about, can you, in your own judgment, based on what your hands should feel like and what the sights should look like and what your feet should feel like when you're in a good position, are you doing the right stuff that you should be doing? And as you go into more late cycle training, this is where you'll be adding more positional movement. So maybe more barricades, more shooting through a port. Maybe you rig up a low port or something like that. and you're doing more match-like, stage-like practice. And again, the goal is not necessarily to chase a particular part time, although you can, in a given session, you can establish a goal and say, 7 seconds on this sort of array where I shoot 3 targets from this position, reload to the second position, and shoot 3 different targets. 7 seconds is a good par time. And maybe some of the target engagement orders will be easier, some will be harder, but you can at least have that par time there so that the second beep is coming to give you the pressure. But to me, what I find is working in this environment where every run is a cold run, to me, puts enough pressure all by itself, where every run you're feeling like you're both trying to navigate in the sense of trying to remember, okay, do this, then do that, then do this, reload, and then, or whatever it is that you have programmed into the drill. Trying to do that while also executing the technique is enough to simulate sort of the level of cognitive load that you end up being under in a match. And for more discussion of this kind of training, if you go back to the beginning of the year, in episode 91, I talked about the Eric Graffel class that I took. And this is something that he has been associated with, not just by me, but it's sort of something that a training method and methodology that he talks about and is associated with. And to me, that the place for that kind of training is especially in the later cycle. Now, am I saying if you have a 36 days until your next match and you do that kind of training before day 24 that you're a failure? No, obviously you can, the lines can be blurry. You can gradually transition from one to the other. You can keep working your one-shot draws all the way up until the end if you feel like that's a useful drill that still, whether it's, helps you focus, helps you get warmed up at the beginning of a session, whatever it is. Obviously you can blend these things, but just in terms of setting up a structure, a way to periodize your training so that you're not just endlessly grinding the same drills in the same way over and over again 365 days out of the year, that's where, to me, this structure helps. And one sort of final tip or technique or training method that is worth mentioning that I find myself using in sort of later cycle training is just the approach of taking away the part time on the timer, but then at the end of a drill, once I've shot everything, taking my non-dominant hand and slapping the timer with it, which will register as a shot and give me an end time. And, in some cases, I'll just do this over and over again and sort of register different times for different runs of the drill. Sometimes I will use that to sort of set a par time. That's not my goal with a sort of late stage setting a par time by slapping the timer type of approach is not to set a par time that I'm then going to beat down, 10th by 10th. The goal is actually then becomes to consistently be able to execute comfortably within that par time, and then actually start taking on harder and harder target orders in that same par time. So, for example, if you do some kind of, like I was saying earlier, you start in one position, you draw, you engage 3 targets, and then you do a reload, move to a second position, and engage 3 more targets. If you set the time by slapping the timer with a relatively easy target engagement order, and then you can sort of comfortably hit that rather than trying to beat the time down, start picking harder and harder engagement orders where maybe you're sweeping back and forth between the extreme left and the extreme right back to the extreme left target. So you're, quote unquote, shooting the same target twice in one position, but what it's doing is adding a lot of longer transitions. Or, maybe you're drawing, instead of drawing to paper, you're drawing to a steel target, something like that. And so within that par time that you have set, just by running the drill, slapping the timer, and establishing what is a reasonable goal for you, you then, instead of trying to bring the time down, you bring the difficulty up. And honestly, I find that's really, it gives you a lot of confidence. It's really helpful when you feel like you're looking at something that is a completely illogical, kind of insane target engagement order, and you get confidence in executing it and being able to visualize and then actually make it happen. That makes it so that on match day, it's much easier when you walk up to a stage and there's 1 or 2 targets that you have to engage in a slightly weird order. In contrast to your practice, it's kind of no big deal. And I think it's worth saying that, one of the things that I find useful is each day after dry fire, just writing sort of a quick paper journal of, here's what I did, here's what I noticed, and just sort of do a brain dump of just interesting things you noticed or things that you tried that worked, things that you tried that didn't, And it's not so much that you're necessarily going to go back and read these notes in depth or type them up or archive them in any way, but it's more about just at the end of it, just having that, taking, if you're spending 20 minutes dry firing, spending 3 minutes just reflecting on what you did and just trying to say, this went well, this went poorly, or like we talked about earlier, making notes of things. Hey, this is kind of interesting. Maybe come back and look at this again next time. And next time might be at your next session, right? It might be, hey, I think this is a good drill to work on tomorrow. Or it might be some technique change or something to explore that you don't want to confuse yourself by doing right now, but you make a note for it so that when you go into your next early cycle training, you have that list of things to sort of start from. And then, of course, in the case of working up to a major match, you go and you shoot the match. And what I find is useful is after each stage, well, first of all, get video of each stage. I get first person and third person video of each stage, but the first person really is just so people watching on YouTube can see what the targets are. And I don't personally find a lot of training and an analytical value from the first person video. To me, third person, if nothing else, it can kind of cue me to remember what I was feeling subjectively when I was shooting it. So if you are going to shoot a match, if nothing else, buddy up with someone on your squad and have them record you on your phone and offer to record them on their phone. And that way you guys, it's kind of you're taking care of each other. And so you're motivated to make sure that each of you is getting recorded. But definitely whatever you do, if you're traveling to any kind of match or, a level 2 match that you're working towards all season, definitely get video of it just so you can remember what happened. And then at the end of each stage, when you go to reload your mags and, reset for the next stage, just take some quick notes, just not conclusions, just observations about what you saw, what you felt, what kind of happened, what was surprising. If there was, coming in on this target, I shot 3 because the second one felt like it was high left or something like that. And this can be paper notes in a notebook. This can be typing notes into your phone. For expediency, probably the quickest way would just be to do some kind of voice memo and then transcribe it later. Just talk into your phone and just kind of do a stream of consciousness brain dump. Any of these work, but the goal is what you want to give yourself is the ability after the match to go back and analyze and look for trends, because there might be something that happens on stage 2 that at the time seems like a strange one-off thing that doesn't mean anything to you. But if you were just sort of acting as kind of a casual observer, you would make a note of it. And then it may turn out that the same thing happens on stage 7 and 9. And now you've got the documentation to do the analysis and draw the trend and see, okay, this was happening repeatedly in these scenarios. And you want to have the evidence to do that. You want to have that data to be able to do that analysis after the big match. And so both gathering the third person video to do analysis and sort of see how your shooting went, but then also having some kind of subjective observational information as soon after you shot the stage as you can. Putting those two together in your post-match analysis is useful. And then after you shoot a big match, go home, read your notes, edit your match video, whether you post it or not, doesn't matter, but watch it over, gather the data and try and look for strengths and weaknesses, look for things that you can say your training cycle went well, so things to continue. Look for things that either you didn't practice or the way you practiced them was ineffective, and so that gives you the list to take into your next training cycle. And don't just do what you see some people do, where they're like, oh, I didn't finish as high as I wanted to, but on to the next one. And so it's almost like they're using the next match as an excuse to forget about this one. Don't do that. Take the time, let kind of the results settle in of this match, let it percolate, watch your match videos, and really let it kind of settle in, let your brain process it, because you won't necessarily see something the first time watching the video, but it might be that something starts to click. And especially as you start to dry fire again for the next match, you might start to something might become clear that you noticed, but you couldn't really make sense of. And so you don't just want, as soon as the match is over, to take the scores as dead and gone and forget about it. No, the result of that match is part of the foundational data that then provides you direction for your next training cycle. And so that's why it becomes cyclical. Each match that you shoot, each bit of training that you do, even your, like I was saying, the notes that you take in the weeks leading up to each match, they sort of provide the blueprint, your starting place to start the next training cycle. And the idea here is by always kind of varying things in this way, you're never just repeating the same stuff, but you're always doing things inside of a structure where you are constantly improving, but you're improving in different areas. And to me, this sort of helps break up the monotony of, like I said before, just doing the same drills over and over again. And then, hey, you've got a match, you improved or you didn't, and it's very monotonous. So for me, like I said, I've got the North Carolina section match, which I am working as staff, but I'll be shooting with the staff on staff day. And, it's pretty well known that you're never going to shoot 100% as well as you can on staff day as you would as just a regular competitor. But I think we are getting closer to giving our staff a chance to shoot the best they can. One thing we did last year that I think was successful, and we are repeating again, is each squad on staff day will have an embedded RO who will shoot the match sometime during the weekend. So that embedded RO is just focused on running the timer for every single shooter for every single stage, so that yes, the folks shooting on the squad on staff day will have to hot potato the tablet around between them, but it's at least a little bit more time that you have where you're not trading off the timer between you, so everybody gets a little bit more time to rest, sit down, drink some water, eat some food, and just generally be more prepared for each stage by having the embedded ROs. So that worked well last year. We're going to keep it going this year. So hopefully I'll be able to shoot somewhat close to how I would if I were just a straight up competitor. And I'm definitely taking this match as seriously as I can with, the family commitments and whatnot. But I'm training for this. I have, 36 days. And so the next roughly 2 weeks will be focused on these kinds of early cycle drills. And I'll be sort of working my way through this. And then once that match is over, like I said, I'll have 2 months until IPSC Nationals, where I will undergo this again, and hopefully it'll lead to good results. If it doesn't, hopefully I'll learn how to modify the process to improve it for the next time and just keep it going, keep learning, keep trying to get a little bit better every year, both in my actual shooting and in sort of the meta skill of getting better at shooting, which to me is what is the interesting part of the sport. It's not just, ripping a fast draw or bill drill or classify or whatever, but it's the continual process of learning, the process of improving, the process of figuring out how to practice more efficiently is it's interesting to me. That's part of the reason I started this podcast, and I'm glad to actually get to talk about practice and shooting for once, and a little bit less USPSA politics. So that wraps up this episode of Short Course. My email is ben@berryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.